The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest and most continuous naval confrontation of World War II, stretching from 1939 until the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. Fought in the Atlantic between the European Axis powers and the Allies, the battle played a crucial role in the naval history of the conflict. Initially, the United Kingdom and France, members of the Allies, imposed a naval blockade against Nazi Germany. With the fall of France, the British Navy extended the blockade to fascist Italy as well. Starting in 1941, the Axis powers, through their submarine fleets, began attempting to blockade Allied naval routes in the Atlantic. Their goals were to disrupt the supply lines to the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, prevent the arrival of American troops in the European theater of operations, and stop the supply of resources to the Allies in the Asian and Pacific theaters of operations. After Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare in World War I, several attempts were made to limit or abolish submarines. However, these efforts were unsuccessful. The London Naval Treaty required submarines to follow the cruiser rules, which demanded that submarines surface, search, and place the crews of ships in a safe place before sinking them, unless the targeted ship showed persistent refusal to stop or active resistance to visit or search. These regulations did not prohibit the arming of merchant ships, but by doing so, or by reporting contact with submarines or raiders, they effectively became naval auxiliaries and lost the protection granted by the cruiser rules. This rendered the restrictions on submarines practically meaningless. From the beginning of the conflict, the Germans recognized that Allied naval supremacy posed a potential threat to their war plans. To lead the German U-boat fleet, Hitler appointed Karl Dönitz, who already had experience as a submariner in World War I and understood both the needs of sailors and the potential of submarines as weapons of war. However, Hitler's rush to start the conflict caught Dönitz by surprise. He had hoped for a few more years of peace until he could build a fleet powerful enough to threaten trade between the British and the Americans. In September 1939, at the start of World War II, the admiral commanded only 57 submarines, far fewer than the 300 vessels needed for an effective blockade against Great Britain. Life aboard a German submarine is described by war survivors as unsanitary, to say the least. Inside a fragile, pressurized hull, only the captain had a private cabin. The rest of the crew had to settle between tubes, torpedoes, navigation equipment, and other machinery to eat, operate the systems, and perform their physiological needs. Since U-boats had no internal ventilation, sailors were forced to move quietly and avoid excessive physical effort in order not to deplete the oxygen. A U-boat was powered by large diesel engines, which needed surface air to operate and to recharge the batteries that powered the electric motors used underwater for at least 4 hours a day. During this period, the submarine was at risk of being attacked by enemy aircraft, a common occurrence later in the conflict, when the Allies developed a radar system that drastically reduced the power of the U-boats. The main weapons used by submarines were torpedoes. A torpedo could be described as a micro-submarine once launched. It contained an explosive charge at its tip that detonated upon contact with the hull of the enemy ship. However, launching them was not a simple task. The commander needed to carefully calculate the distance between his submarine and the enemy ship before firing the torpedo, preferably at a shallow depth. Once in the water, the torpedo's propellers left a trail of bubbles that could reveal its presence to the enemy and give them time to evade. As the conflict worsened, the Germans developed a kerosene-powered torpedo that minimized this trail. In addition to torpedoes, many submarines were equipped with deck guns, often used to sink smaller vessels or to deliver the final blow without needing to use torpedoes. Dönitz astutely understood the power of his submarines for one simple reason: the Allies' ineffectiveness in combating them without limiting themselves to the use of ship convoys. The ASDIC system, which stands for Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, composed of audio frequencies capable of detecting the presence of a submarine, was useless against submarines that fired their torpedoes from the surface. As a result, U-boat commanders were ordered to attack on the surface of the water. This included targeting tankers with their easily flammable cargo, as well as ships carrying military supplies. During the early years of the Battle of the Atlantic, for the reasons mentioned above, the Allies had little or no success in containing the Nazi submarine threat, even with their ships sailing in convoys. Dönitz also instructed his captains to adopt the Wolfpack tactic, in German, Rudeltaktik. A submarine commander who located an Allied convoy would radio its route to nearby submarines, which would then join together to attack the convoy at night, causing significant losses. Consequently, an alarming number of merchant and warships were sunk by skilled German commanders. At times, the rate at which Allied ships were being sunk exceeded the capacity of shipyards to replace them. Winston Churchill, in his memoirs, described the U-boats as the greatest threat to victory over Nazism. It is no surprise that he feared the sinkings caused by U-boats more than any other weapon of Adolf Hitler. Despite the Germans being on the defensive on the Eastern Front, in the Atlantic they were still at an advantage. March of 1943 was the worst month of the war for the Allies at sea. They lost 51 ships during that period. But the Allies' distress came to an end in May 1943, when John Randall, a British scientist, announced the invention of a new radar system with short waves and compact enough in size to be installed on aircraft, the centimetric radar. Its principle is the same as conventional radars. A beam of electromagnetic waves is emitted. When an obstacle is encountered, the beam returns. By measuring the time between the reception and the impact with the obstacle, as well as its angle, it is possible to locate the target precisely. Based on this innovation, Allied aviators were able to locate German submarines on the surface with relative ease and sink them with depth charges, submersible bombs shaped like paint cans, which exploded under water pressure. The number of German U-boats sunk increased dramatically, and the sinking of ships decreased considerably. This event became known as the Black May. Dönitz sought out Hitler to communicate the bad news. Mein Führer, the fact is that the Allies now have a new mechanism that allows them to locate our submarines on the surface of the water. Our losses have increased drastically. We must preserve our forces, otherwise we would be playing the enemy's game. Britain was finally saved from Germany's attempt to impose a naval blockade, although at an extremely high cost. More than 2,000 merchant and military ships were sunk, resulting in the loss of more than 13.5 million tons of cargo, and about 40,000 of its most capable sailors died in service. In the same period, the Germans lost, throughout the entire war, 29,000 men and 785 of their 1,162 submarines. Despite the fact that the South Atlantic was the site where the crew of the German cruiser, Admiral Graf Spee, was forced to scuttle their own ship in the first naval battle of World War II, and that Axis submarine operations in the region, centered in the strait between Brazil and West Africa, began in the fall of 1940. It was only in the following year that effective sinking operations began to cause serious concern in Washington. This threat perceived by the Americans led them to decide that, in addition to British outposts along the Caribbean and the West African coast, it would be essential to introduce American military forces on the Brazilian coastline. This occurred after a series of negotiations with the then Brazilian dictatorship during the second half of 1941. This U.S. military presence in Brazil was not well received by Berlin and Rome, especially after the severance of diplomatic relations between Brazil and the Axis powers in January 1942, which led Germany and Italy to extend their submarine warfare to Brazilian ships wherever they were, including Brazilian territorial waters, starting in April 1942. In May, the first retaliatory attacks by Brazil, through its air force, against Axis submarines occurred, but only on August 22, 1942, did Brazil officially enter the war. This was of great importance to the battle, given its stature and strategic position in the South Atlantic. Although small, The Brazilian Navy at the time had mine-layer ships and modern aircraft, which only required minor modifications to become suitable for maritime patrol and ocean escort. During its 3 years of war, mainly but not exclusively in the South Atlantic, the Brazilian Navy escorted 3,167 ships in 614 convoys, totaling 16.5 million tons, with losses of only 0.1%. Brazil saw 3 of its warships sunk and 486 men killed in action, 332 of them on the cruiser Bahia alone, although only the cargo and troop transport ship Vital de Oliveira was sunk by enemy action. On the other hand, the Brazilian Merchant Navy recorded the loss of 972 people, including crew members and passengers, who perished aboard its 32 ships attacked by enemy submarines. The U.S. and Brazilian naval air forces worked closely together until the end of the battle. One example of this was the successful attack on U-199 on July 31, 1943, through coordinated action by aircraft from both countries. In Brazilian waters alone, 11 other Axis submarines were confirmed sunk between January and September 1943. 1 Italian of the Archimede class and 10 German submarines, U-128, U-161, U-164, U-507, U-513, U-590, U-591, U-598, U-604, and U-662. By the end of 1943, the reduction in the number of Allied transport ships sunk in the South Atlantic coincided with the growing elimination of Axis submarines operating in the region. From that moment on, the battle in the South Atlantic was lost for the Germans, even though most of the remaining submarines in the region only received official orders to withdraw in August of the following year, and the last Allied merchant ship, the Baron Jedburgh, was still sunk by a U-boat, U-532, on March 10, 1945. The Germans failed to interrupt the flow of strategic supplies to Britain. This failure resulted in the accumulation of troops and supplies necessary for the D-Day landings. The defeat of the submarines was a crucial precursor to the buildup of Allied troops and supplies, ensuring Germany's defeat. Victory was achieved at an extremely high cost. Between 1939 and 1945, 3,500 Allied merchant ships, totaling 14.5 million gross tons, and 175 Allied warships were sunk, and about 72,200 Allied naval and merchant sailors lost their lives. The vast majority of the Allied warships lost in the Atlantic, and nearby coasts were small ships with an average weight of around 1,000 tons, such as frigates, destroyer escorts, sloops, submarine chasers, or corvettes. The Germans lost 783 submarines and approximately 30,000 sailors, representing 3/4 of Germany's submarine fleet of 40,000 men. Losses to the German surface fleet were also significant, with 4 battleships, 9 cruisers, 7 raiders, and 27 destroyers sunk. Let's now take a look at the merchant navy of the United Kingdom, the USA, Canada, and Norway. United Kingdom. During World War II, almost 1/3 of all commercial ships around the world were British. Between 1939 and 1945, more than 30,000 sailors from the British Merchant Navy lost their lives, and more than 2,400 The ships were crewed by sailors from various parts of the British Empire, including about 25% from India and China, and 5% from the West Indies, the Middle East, and Africa. British officers wore uniforms that closely resembled those of the Royal Navy, while ordinary sailors did not have uniforms. During their leave in Britain, they sometimes faced mockery and abuse from civilians who mistakenly believed that the sailors were avoiding mandatory military service. In response to this, the crew members began wearing a lapel badge with the initials MN to indicate their service in the Merchant Navy. The British merchant fleet was composed of a variety of ships from different private shipping companies, such as the tankers of the British Tanker Company and the cargo ships of Ellerman and Silver Lines. Additionally, during the war period, the British government, through the Ministry of War Transport, commissioned the construction of new ships known as Empire ships. United States. In addition to its existing merchant fleet, during World War II, shipyards in the United States built 2,710 Liberty ships, totaling 38.5 million tons. This number far exceeded the 14 million tons of ships that German submarines were able to sink throughout the conflict. The Canadian Merchant Navy was vital to the Allied cause during World War II. More than 70 Canadian merchant ships were lost. It is estimated that 1,600 merchant sailors were killed, including 8 women. Information obtained by British agents about the movements of German ships led Canada to requisition all its merchant ships 2 weeks before actually declaring war, with the Royal Canadian Navy taking control of all ships on August 26, 1939. At the beginning of the war, Canada had 38 ocean-going merchant ships. By the end of the hostilities, more than 400 cargo ships had been built in Canada. Canadian officers wore uniforms that were practically identical in style to those of the British. Ordinary sailors were given a MN Canada badge to wear on their lapels when on leave, to indicate their service. At the end of the war, Rear Admiral Leonard Murray, Commander-in-Chief of the Canadian Northwest Atlantic, observed, "The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by any Navy or Air Force. It was won by the courage, fortitude, and determination of the British and Allied Merchant Navy." Norway. Before World War II, the Norwegian Merchant Navy was the 4th largest in the world, and its ships were recognized as the most advanced of the time. Both the Germans and the Allies recognized the strategic importance of this fleet, and after Germany's invasion of Norway in April 1940, both sides sought to take control of the ships. The Norwegian collaborationist leader Vidkun Quisling, appointed by the Nazis, ordered Norwegian ships to sail to German, Italian, or neutral ports, but this order was ignored. Instead, all Norwegian ships chose to serve the interests of the Allies, being placed under the control of Nortra Ship, an entity managed by the Norwegian government with offices in London and New York. The modern ships of Nortra Ship, particularly the tankers, played a crucial role for the Allies, transporting nearly 1/3 of the oil destined for Britain during the war. However, historical records reveal that 694 Norwegian ships were sunk during the conflict, which represented approximately 47% of the total fleet. By the end of the war, in 1945, it is estimated that the Norwegian merchant fleet had 1,378 ships, and more than 3,700 Norwegian merchant sailors lost their lives. If you believe that this video has added value to you in any way and would like to further support our work here on YouTube, consider supporting the channel by subscribing and leaving your like. May God bless you all and see you soon.